Well, there is a coaster there.
Oh, there is.
We are.
Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I gave you a water, but
No.
Well, you're on
So-
top of it. You can take that one on your
that one is cold.
Yes.
So do you prefer cold?
Yes.
We'll just keep this right over here for you.
All right. I'm not going to sit on that because you guys, I do not know how to sit like a lady on a chair.
Wait, do you want a normal size
You want a
chair?
short chair?
Yeah, short chair.
We can swap.
Here.
I mean, you know, they would do like a Hillary Clinton thing on me, right? Like they did on her in
That's
South
right.
America, where
That's
they
right.
then
The
use
photo
it.
shoot or first
They'd
down.
use it for lingerie
And then,
sales.
and then she wears pants for the rest of her life. Right.
Like an intimate setting here.
There you go.
Maybe we should get a little small sofa for the author.
Do you have a best friend who can send us one of those?
Best friend.
Okay.
Don't know
Right.
it yet.
Yes, ask around.
I certainly can.
What a beautiful bookstore, by the way. It's really lovely and cozy.
you.
I do love it. And of course, the name is perfect for October.
All right, we're ready.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out today. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Ginger Olszewski, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's visit with author Karen Spears Zacharias, co-hosted by our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center and NeverMore Books. We're delighted to host Karen as part of her tour for her new true crime book, The Murder Gene. Famed Southern storyteller George Singleton said of the book, "Written with compassion and insight, The Murder Gene comes off as a cross between Forensic Files and In Cold Blood." I love this book. Bob Welch, author of Boy in the Mirror, said, "In a world of dime a dozen crime stories, Zacharias unearths one like no other I've read. This exhaustively researched book is deep in its linking of two murders to nature as well as nurture, wide in its piecing together thousands of pieces to create a single puzzle, and chilling in its reminder that evil, unfortunately, abides. The result is a book that will make you reconsider the insidiousness of murder in an all-new way." Karen Spears Zacharias is an award-winning author of numerous books of both fiction and nonfiction. A former crime beat reporter, she has taught journalism at Central Washington University, and her work has been featured on NPR, CNN, and Good Morning America. Her op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. A Gold Star daughter, Karen and her husband Tim now make their home in Deschutes County, Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Karen to NeverMore Books.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, too. And it's such an honor to be here at NeverMore Books and with Jonathan and the Pat Conroy Center, which, you know, has my heart. This story is a definite, different approach to a crime story. I was a crime beat reporter in the town of Pendleton, Oregon, which is famed for its Roundup rodeo that comes there. So next to Calgary, it's the biggest rodeo in all of North America. About 50,000 people come to town for the rodeo every September. In August of 2012, I got a phone call from one of my children telling me that a girl that we all knew as a family had been murdered in Pendleton. I wasn't living in Pendleton at that time, nor was I working as a reporter at that time. I had moved on to write books, but I had a working relationship with the police in Pendleton, both county police, state police, and local police. And so the girl's name is Amy Jane Brandhagen, and the way I knew Amy Jane was that her parents went to the same church we went to, and they belonged to the same Bible study that we belonged to. And I first met Amy Jane when she was about 2 or 3 years old because I was doing a feature story on her grandmother. And so in that way, community members, I'm sure you do this here in Beaufort as well, you watch a child grow up, go through elementary and high school. My husband was a high school teacher, so we knew them very well, and Amy Jane on occasion, my girls would go and babysit for the family. So when I got the call that Amy Jane had been murdered, I was shocked, as murder of that nature was pretty unusual in that town. I waited about 3 or 4 months, and there wasn't very much coming out in the newspaper. We didn't know the manner of death, how she died. There had been no arrest of who had killed her. And so I sent an email to the chief of police, whom I knew from other work I'd done, and his name was Stuart Roberts, and I said, Stuart, is there a story here? And he said, I think so. So we made arrangements to meet at a coffee shop there in Pendleton called Hamley's. And while we were meeting over coffee, Amy Jane's dad came in. So obviously, if you're the father of a murdered child and you walk into a coffee shop and you see the chief of police there with a former reporter, you can make some quick assumptions about what we're talking about. So at that time, Stuart still did not give me any idea of how Amy Jane died, but I asked him questions about, did he have any clues as to who may have done this? Because social media had blown up in the way that social media does, and they had started making critical remarks about the police and their lack of making an arrest. Because we always think it should be done in a 24-hour period the way they do on CSI. Only it doesn't work that way, and I knew that. And because I had worked with Stuart, I can't say this about every cop that I worked with over the years, but I knew Stuart to be very professional, and I knew if he was keeping information back, there was a reason for it. So at that meeting, Stuart said, we don't know who did this. For all I know, it could have been somebody coming in off Interstate 85. Could have been a serial killer. And that shocked me, because Interstate 85 is the east-west highway that runs through Oregon, Idaho, all of those areas. We use it all the time, but it is just a hop off the freeway into Pendleton. And I had no idea, had not occurred to me that it was a serial killer. So I just made a note of that, kept it back. I have this thing that I think most writers would have, which is, I'm not going to write the story until you make an arrest, right? Like, I don't want them coming after me. So when they're in prison, come back and see me. Almost a year to the date later, during that year, nobody had been arrested. Almost a year to the day later, another woman I knew named Karen Lang was assaulted on the river walkway, the Umatilla River walkway, and she had disappeared. Nobody knew that she'd been assaulted at that part, just she had gone out for a walk, told her husband, who worked at the college, I'm getting my evening walk in. Again, it's August, it's warm out. In Oregon, we don't get dark until 10 o'clock because we're on the West Coast. So you can go walking at 7 o'clock and still have plenty of light in the summer. She did not show back up. At 7, 8, 9, she's not there. Finally, at 10 o'clock, her husband's worried. He calls friends. They begin a search party looking for Karen. Nothing. All night long, nothing. The next morning, it was a Saturday. It's very busy, the walkway is, because it's near a major park and near the ball field where the kids were all doing their games. And so the cops are out searching for any clues again. And this particular cop just happened to go over into this very dense brush area. And we had video on the river walkway, so you wouldn't think that an attack would happen there because you've got all these video cameras around, except for that one section. And so he heard something or saw something that caught his attention. He goes over there and he sees Karen laying there. and she is battered beyond recognition. He literally thought she was dead. So he, called the police station and said, get down here, I found her, she's dead. And he stops the pedestrians from coming around, and then he goes back over as they're waiting, and he hears a moan. So she wasn't dead, but just a very faint pulse. And so they call for an ambulance. They have to life flight her out of Pendleton to Portland. They gave her a 1% chance of living. She had been beaten so badly. So at that point, they knew for sure, because of the anniversary date of Amy Jane's death, they knew for sure that they had a serial killer that they were dealing with. But they ran DNA tests between Amy Jane's killing and this attack, because one of the cops found a metal pipe over by the Babe Ruth field behind a plywood board, and we're pretty sure that that's what was used. Not only did they have that, they did have video of a guy following Karen along the pathway and then coming back along the pathway and going into the bathroom where they assumed he washed up. That guy was known to the Pendleton police as Danny Wu, which is the name of a martial arts TV cinema star. And he had been arrested numerous times during the year, taken into custody, but never fingerprinted, and never had ID on him, as a lot of homeless people don't. He was not, most of our homeless in that area are known. There are people who've grown up in the area and that kind of thing. But he was a homeless person who had just started appearing. He was young, he was polite, he was never belligerent in any way. Well, he disappeared, quickly after Karen was found. And it took him a few weeks, but they eventually found him hiding in the ceiling tiles of the convention center where the Roundup grounds are, where in September is our big Roundup. So right before that, they make the arrest. His name actually was Luke Chang, and he was from Morganton, North Carolina, which is just up the road from Asheville. He's 23 years old. He was the son of missionaries and had grown up in a pretty fundamentalist Christian home. And so after he's arrested, he confesses to the whole thing, and is sent to prison, where he is still to this day. After all of this happened, then I sent a note back to Stuart and said, okay, so there's a story here, right? He said, yes. So I'm thinking I'm going to be writing about this serial killer who comes to Pendleton and kills a girl I knew, but that he didn't know at all. And that's where the story began. And I FOIA'd the city attorney, got access to all the police files, including the confession tapes and all the video, autopsy reports, everything. And thus began a 10-year-long research journey for me. I am not science-minded. It's not my gift. I am a word person and a storyteller. So I am holed up at the Pendleton Police Office with dozens and dozens of investigative reports, big, thick books of, research that they had done during that whole year that they were trying to figure out who did this thing. And so there are two things that happened over that course of weeks I'm in there recording on and digging through all this. One is that I came across a comment that Luke was really good friends with a guy named Casey Byram's out of Coleman, Alabama. Well, I'm in Pendleton, Oregon. Probably very few people in Pendleton have been to Coleman, Alabama. But I have been to Coleman, Alabama numerous times because I have a girlfriend there who worked for the paper. And I had gone there on a retreat once. I've spoken to book clubs there numerous times. She does a big literary event every year, so I had been there. I thought, well, that is just weird, you know, kind of that poetry thing that I look for when I'm doing my writing. And I thought, well, that's just an encouragement that I'm the right person to be doing this, right? Because I have this background and will be able to do further investigative work on this particular fellow. And then the next thing I come across a day or two later is just one sentence that says that Luke's grandfather was in prison. And so I went to Stuart and said, do you know why Luke's granddad had been in prison? And he said, no, I didn't know he was. I said, and so I said, can you find out? And so the next day, he gives me a little newspaper article. It's just 2 paragraphs. It's from the 1970s, and it says that Gene Lincoln had been arrested in Michigan for the murder of a girl and the attempted abduction of another girl. And that had happened some 40 years prior. So then, of course, I sent away for all the court records I could find and began this trail of finding out what had happened with Luke's grandfather. How had he come to murder this girl? Did he know her? Who was he? I found out that he had been a tax assessor for the county at one point. I've worked with plenty of tax assessors as a reporter. They're not usually who I'm peg as, you know, the next serial killer in the neighborhood. It's usually the person you don't peg that is. So anyway, he had been married. He had 4 or 5 kids. Luke's mother was one of those kids. And he had a drinking problem. And he had gotten into an argument with his wife and then just took off over Memorial Day weekend of 1973, went to this campground where this young co-ed had a campground out, which one's first, Wisconsin, Michigan, I always get them confused. Anyway, he had gone to King Lake area, and there had been a young co-ed, it was break time for her, and she had gone out there to do some ghost, you know, hauntings. She went, took her photo, she was an artist, so she took her notepads and did all of that, and she went up there to do that, and he murdered her that night. And they couldn't find her. And a few months later, he attempts at another lake area up in the Michigan, Wisconsin area to abduct a 12-year-old girl. That 12-year-old girl fought him off. Like, he got her in the car. He had waited for her and her girlfriend. He had been stalking them. He had been waiting for her. She lived at the lake, but she and her girlfriend were camping out that night. And he waited outside the tent till daybreak, and then he took her by knife point. And she fought him from the very first, so her hands were bloody. And he got her in the car, and he had removed the door handles in the car. So you can't get out through the door handles, right? So the windows are locked. She eventually is able to pull that steering wheel and run the car into a tree stump. And then she can get out because he can't move the car at that point. He gets away again without her. But I was able, because she had an unusual name. You know, it used to be reporters could use a phone book and go find anybody. You know, Google does not serve us well on that. But she had an unusual last name and an unusual first name. So I began to see if I could find this woman. Like, she would be my age. And so where was this girl who had fought off this other, apparently, serial killer? Because she would be dead if he had been able to abduct her. So I did. it was weird, but the way I did it was through obituaries. So I typed in her name as survivor and Obed, and then because unusual last name, it popped up in Michigan, and I just started calling people in Michigan with that name, and I got a cousin of hers who then put me in touch with her husband, who then put me in touch with her. She had never told anybody this story in all those years, never ever talked about it. The night I called her, her husband had given me her cell phone number. She was a janitor at the local college. When do janitors work?
Right.
At night, right. So I call her at night, and the minute I say Jean Dale Lincoln, she, you know, it just terrifies her. Even though he was dead by that point. Like I said, I'm trying to wait till they're in prison or dead before I tell these stories. But all of that together got me thinking about the issue of violence and whether it is inherited or not. If you have grandchildren or children, you know this, right? You've done this, right? You've seen a trait that you like in your grandchild or your child, and you go, she gets that from my side of the family, right? Or you have a child who does something you don't like, or a grandchild you don't like the way they behave, and you say, that comes from your side of the family, right? I have done this a dozen times myself. I have a grandson that looks so much like my husband that my daughter is constantly asked, isn't it weird to like give birth to your dad? He looks like him, he acts like him. He's just a fair version of my husband. So I began this 10-year journey of going into the DNA. Is there a connection? We always hear about nurture, and we have been raised with that only as our model, with good reasons, because of the eugenics movement that happened in the 20s and 30s, which we still have not recovered from. So, you know, our social science had been focused during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s into today, had been focused on the nurture aspect of it, and that violence was a learned behavior, and that these kind of things are learned. And if we do a good job of parenting, of course, this is always on the mom, right? If the mom does a really good job of parenting, if the boy can attach to the mom, all of those things, then we don't have to worry about it. And I began to think, well, why are we so willing to accept that our good traits are inherited, but unwilling to accept that our bad traits maybe have a biological component as well? So this non-science girl began studying the science of that, and there, as you know, the research on DNA is happening every single day. And gene editing became one of the questions that came up. Do we have the power to gene edit diseases out? Do we then also have the power to gene edit violence out of people? One of the things I learned during all of this is we do have a gene that is more aggressive and more violent, and it's called, in that vernacular of journalists who always look to put the good spin on things, military, it's called the warrior gene, right? But it's not just a warrior gene. And so I explained that in the book. But the one thing that kept coming up over and over again as I did the research, as I went to Morganton and tracked down the people who knew Luke as a boy, and tracked down the people that already knew Amy Jane, and talked to the attorneys who had handled the case for Jean's father, I began to look at that question of what is our responsibility here? Is incarceration our only answer? Or do we have some tools available to us that we need to start thinking about, because gene editing is way far ahead of where we are legislatively on this issue. Just like technology, we've got congressmen who can't figure out how to use an iPhone, so they can't possibly legislate social media because they don't even know what it is. And so that's kind of where we are in gene editing with, these kind of issues. So I did track down a guy out of Florida State University who's been on the forefront of some of this, and he explained it this way to me. He said, my father had diabetes. The likelihood that I could have diabetes is high because I'm a carrier for that. But I can control that by how I eat and the lifestyle I lead. And so I may or may not get diabetes, but I have some control over that. And so it's what they call the impression that happens upon that genome that affects that aggressive gene. Fortunately, women, we don't carry. We're carriers for it, but we don't have that aggressive gene the way it comes out in men, certain men. So it is Luke's mom who's the carrier for it. We don't know for sure that Luke has it or that his grandfather has it. It seems like there's a high likelihood that there is a DNA connection between the two. Now, the question I had to ask is, how much access did Gene Lincoln have to Luke Chang growing up? His parents were missionaries. They lived part of the time, but currently still live in Taiwan. So I had to go back to Morganton and track down people who knew Luke. And here's what I found out. That just, I was expecting to find that he was killing cats when he was 10 and, disruptive in school and all these things. I didn't find any of that. Nothing. No one I spoke to had anything negative to say about Luke. Not one single person. So I want to read to you just a brief part of the book that really struck me as I went to Morganton and looked at Luke's past. The Chang family photo is just one of dozens and dozens of other missionary photos displayed outside the church's main sanctuary. New Manna Church is what some around these parts of North Carolina refer to as that mega church. It's difficult to determine where all the people come from, given that Marion's population is barely over 7,000 and there's about a dozen churches in town. But the sizable parking lot is packed by the time Sunday morning service rolls around. New Manna bills itself as that old-fashioned, independent, fundamental KJB. That last part, KJB, is code for believers. It means that the only Bible they use is the King James Version. It also means that they take it literally, as in the earth was created in 6 days, and men are meant to rule over every creature, including women. This is a church where men are referred to as brother and women are referred to as sister. Men wear off-the-rack suits with white knotted ties, and the women are all clothed in dresses below the knee. There's no cleavage, no bare arms, no flesh exposed beyond their feet and face, and a woman wearing slacks will be warmly welcomed, but all the little girls will stare and ask questions to their mother about why that woman is not wearing a dress like them. And I know that because I wear those slacks. The people at New Manna still consider Luke family. They are a closed-mouth group for whom loyalty has become a cult-like persuasion. They remain the home-based church for Jay and Heidi's mission work, so there is a deep sense of protection for them. So deep is that protection that emails sent to former youth members who are no longer even live in North Carolina were quickly relayed back to staff members at the church, warning them that there was a writer snooping around asking questions about Luke. That Klan behavior has also been applied to the church's founding pastor, who is alleged to have sexual indiscretions. That's code used by church members to hide either illicit affairs or sexual assaults. Catholics aren't the only faith group to cover for church leaders' wrongdoings. Fundamentalists do it too. It wasn't until I showed up at the church and began speaking to people face to face that I was finally able to get Luke's former youth pastor to speak on the record. Of all the troubling twists and turns of the story, I think that meeting brother Jason Garner and his wife's sister Tricia solidified the thing that I still find unsettling about the murder of Amy Jane Brandhagen. This feeling that had Luke and Amy Jane met as kids in youth group, they would have made the best of friends. They had so much in common. While Amy wasn't the daughter of missionaries, her parents, Dave and Kathy Brandhagen, have long been widely respected as people of faith in the community of Pendleton. The year she was murdered, Amy went on a mission trip to India. She returned home with a bigger vision for herself and for the world. Amy Jane's heart was wide open with love and hope for humanity. Sharing the love of Jesus with others was her daily mission. She had that in common with Luke's entire family. Luke and Amy Jane were both highly intellectual young people who loved to read and go on adventures. They were imaginative, creative souls. Both were regarded as good-hearted people, always eager to be of help to somebody in need. They were playful older siblings to their younger sisters. Amy was more gregarious than Luke, so she had a wider circle of friendships, but both found their strongest social interactions within the church. And both had mothers who they regarded as overprotective and overwrought at times. Mothers who wanted one thing most of all, to keep their children safe from the evils of the world. And that really struck me, is that had he literally waited for her and stalked her and murdered her, never had a conversation with her, never had an encounter with her, and yet he murdered this precious girl that had he ever had a conversation with her, they would have had so much in common. And why does a boy who's raised in Morganton in this missionary family that beyond being fundamentalist, nobody had anything negative to say. It wasn't a harsh background. It wasn't, to any of my research, an abusive background on any level. So why did he do this? And that's what I tackle in this book. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the story.
I'm a little confused on one point. At the beginning, you didn't set out the circumstances under which Amy Jane was murdered. You did mention she was murdered, but what was the automatic tie to the assault later on? I mean, that couldn't have been just a one-year anniversary thing.
Yeah, it was just the one-year anniversary. It didn't have anything to do with it. That's common among serial killers, to do repeat crimes on the anniversary of the former crimes. So it wasn't the exact date, but it was within a week of the exact date. And so the interesting thing on the killing of Amy Jane is that Luke, every day, as a lot of homeless people do, he went to the library. He was an avid reader. He read all the time. And so he was in that library every single day. The library is directly across the street. It's City Hall, so it's directly across the street from the Travel Lodge. Amy Jane had been working in the Travel Lodge for 4 days. Mm-hmm. And she had a habit, this isn't normal, I know, because I was a motel maid in college. You might have been as well, but normally you go knock on the door and open the door when you're ready to clean the room, if no one's there. Amy Jane had gone down the length of the rooms, 10 rooms she was to clean, and unlocked all the doors and opened them up. And I'm sure she did that to air them out, right? But he was standing on the landing at the library. He could look directly across the street at the Travel Lodge, the second floor. He could see that maid cart. he could see which room she was in, and he went and waited in the bathroom of one of those rooms until she came in.
And,
He attempted, so Luke was a Marine who had gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton. And I believe that's why he came to Pendleton, Oregon. Camp Pendleton's in California. He took a bus, and he didn't get off that bus until he got to Pendleton, Oregon, and I'm sure it was just the familiarity of the name. So there had been something that had happened in California, that impression on that genome that I talk about. There had been a triggering event that happened in California that then sent him AWOL from the Marines. So as a Marine, he had been trained on how to choke people out, and he attempted that, but he wasn't big enough to choke Amy out, so then he brutally stabbed her to death.
There's a series now on Apple TV called Defending Jacob.
Yes,
And it's
I know
all
that
about
one.
the murder gene. And the point being that the defense attorney figured that if the kid who had been charged with killing somebody was convicted, they did all these DNA tests, and his grandfather had been convicted and was serving a prison term, didn't know his grandfather, for rape and murder. So he had the gene. His father did not, also had the gene, and the kid who was on trial didn't have it, and yet in the end, he turns out to be the murderer.
So
But he's free.
So they have actually, defense attorneys have already been attempting to use this.
According to the show, yeah.
Well, I mean, in real life, this is, they really have, there have been cases where they've attempted to use this as an excuse for
Yeah.
whatever crime has happened, and it's always involving murder.
It's fascinating.
It is. Any other questions?
I just was thinking when you said something must have happened, you know, at Camp Pendleton, which I come from a family with a lot of mental illness, and so I know that triggering factor, like they can be fine and then something triggers.
Right.
So I mean, it's kind of listening to it's like a fine line between murder gene and a
Mental illness.
illness, yeah.
So there are triggering factors, and I explain this in the book as best I can with the scientists, different scientists I interviewed. But yes, that is called the impression, and so it isn't one thing, but we have been so focused on the environmental factors that we have overlooked the biological factors that come into play.
Very interesting.
All right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you, NeverMore Books, for hosting us, and Pat Conroy Center always. We love you guys.
Thank you so much for coming, Karen. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.